Dead Space, released in 2008, pioneered a new generation of survival horror. Its dark, gritty atmosphere, cramped, dead, and immersive level design, and its slow, clunky combat created a game that emitted a hopelessness like no other. Perfect for a game about a middle-aged man traveling to visit his girlfriend and repair a ship in the middle of a restricted part of space, only for the whole operation to be an inside job, and for the entire ship to be overrun by the Thing-inspired monstrosities. This oppressive and shocking experience immediately became a classic. The game would become revered for its difficulty and diversity in gameplay and its excellently tragic story. But the story in Dead Space is not what I'm here to talk about today. The story of Dead Space, however, now that is something worth exploring the universe for. The tale is nearly as dark and depressing as the original, but just like any tragic story, there are glimmers of hope and moments of triumph. This is the story of a man who did the impossible and created a speedrun so unbeatable that it may have just killed the Dead Space speedrun forever. And he did so by doing a trick that is so hard, no one else has ever done it in a run. Before we can get there though, I need to explain some of the history of Dead Space speedrunning. The history of possibly one of the most cursed speedruns you'll ever see. You see, the run as it stands today is at its 1 hour and 8 minute world record. Looks nothing like it did just 2.5 years ago, in the second half of 2020. Dead Space speedruns before this time were a dark and dank place, full of unskippable cutscenes and endless elevators. When it comes to speedrunning, few games are as particularly unfun to speedrun as movie games. Games with lots of long, unskippable cutscenes, walk and talk sections, and lots of forced slowdown. In a speedrun, downtime can be good. Having time to stretch or get a drink of water is nice, but when nearly an hour of your life is wasted every single speedrun attempt because you have to sit through cutscene after cutscene, it can become a bit of a daunting and degrading task. Games like this are usually deemed not very good for speedrunning, and for good reason. But even then, it's a rule of the internet. If it exists, someone has done a speedrun of it. And this rule holds true in the case of Dead Space as well. On May 19th of 2020, the world record was held at a 2 hours and 24 minutes by the British runner. He played on the Xbox 360 version of the game, and at the time, he was the best runner of the game by a wide margin. In this period, the run was essentially glitchless. There was one skip on Chapter 2 and one on Chapter 9, but the majority of the run was played as intended. This iteration of the run had a whopping 59 minutes and 41 seconds of downtime. Between the super long introduction cutscene, the seemingly never-ending elevators, and the countless cutscenes, it adds up to about an hour of non-interactive gameplay in a 2 hour and 25 minute run. That's 41.4% of the entire run's playtime being downtime. This makes the game excruciatingly boring and punishing to play, especially because of the structure of the game and its almost perfectly consistent nature. For those who may not know, Dead Space is a chapter-based game. The game is spread out into 12 chapters of relatively equal length. Every chapter besides the first and last start at a tram, and the tram takes you from one chapter to the next. In between tram rides, Isaac will need to go to do a variety of tasks, turn on power, restore life support, grab the captain's rig, and many other events. Almost every single enemy spawn in these chapters is exactly the same every single time. Also, on top of that, on the easy difficulty, enemies die in 1, maybe sometimes 2 well-placed shots. They also almost spawn in 1 at a time every room, and spawn in exactly the same spots every single time, every run. This means that after 1 or 2 playthroughs, you basically will memorize every single enemy spawn and be able to kill them 1 at a time as they spawn with relative ease. It just requires a little bit of practice. The way that most rooms are structured doesn't require you to kill enemies at all, and the ones that do require you to kill enemies are super simple. This manifests in a run that's combat is very easy, and most of the time save comes from having clean lines from room to room and practicing individual sections, small movement optimizations. The best way to practice these small movement optimizations is to actually just do full runs. Small movement optimizations usually come from a large amount of playtime and lots of full game runs, and not so much from individual practice. You can see how that can become a bit of a problem when every run is nearly 2.5 hours long and almost half of that is cutscenes. Not the most engaging experience for a speedrun at least. Now you can see why some might call it cursed. doomed to not be a good speedrun. Doomed to be dead and inactive forever. While there are many factors that are at play for why the game isn't as active as others in a speedrunning sense, I think the primary factor is the quality of life of the run itself. The ratio of gameplay to downtime was too low. The lack of tricks caused the run to just be too long for most people. Usually people like to speedrun games around the 1 hour mark. Anything longer than 2 is much less appealing. So, let's break down exactly what makes this game so long and how it was brought down from the 224 that British Runner got all the way down to the 108.07 that Apathy did. First, I'll explain every chapter in detail so we can get a firm understanding of how the run looked in early 2020. Then I'll explain the absolutely insane revolution that took place just a few months later. If you haven't played the game, I won't be spoiling any major events in the plot, just describing what's required to do each level. I'm going to focus a lot on the ratio of downtime in the run at certain points, as I think this is the best illustration of what level of enjoyment there is in the speedrun at any given time. The more downtime, the less enjoyable. Generally, but not always. Downtime will be defined as any extended moment of non-gameplay, cutscenes, elevators, or rig videos, section where the player cannot control the rate of progression, and are not doing any meaningful gameplay. For example, the turret section on Chapter 4 is downtime. You shoot asteroids for a set amount of time and then it ends. You can fail, but it's so easy that you basically can do it blindfolded. It's almost impossible to fail, and no matter how well you play, you could never make it any faster. A different example is the elevator at the end of Chapter 1. The elevator seemingly goes down to the tram room, but the door will never open until the rig video ends, whether it's 10 seconds to end or 10 minutes. This is downtime. You can't make it go any faster or slower, and you can't do anything important during this time. Chapter 1 starts out with a 4-minute and 47-second introduction cutscene. Isaac rides into the USG Yoshimura with the intention of repairing whatever is wrong with the ship and meeting up with his girlfriend Nicole. Then you're greeted with some tutorials that remind Isaac how to move, and his comrades Kendra and Hammond walk into the entry point of the docks. There is a 23-second waiting period before the door can open. Once inside, Hammond walks to a specific spot, then gives a big speech. Then Isaac has to go to this part of the room and start up the life support systems. This locks him behind the glass, and the hell of dead space is unleashed before your eyes. You are then told to run away, and the door behind you opens. This is where you escape to safety, down an elevator, and collect your first gun, the plasma cutter. Then you are tasked with repairing the tram system, so you can progress into the ship with the hopes to repair it. There are 11 minutes of unskippable cutscenes and downtime in Chapter 1. That's more than the combined time of the entire level's playtime, that being 10 minutes and 38 seconds. Chapter 2. After you repair the tram, you need to get to the ship's pilot's rig from his dead body. But before you can do that, you have to go through another section to get thermite to blow a hole in a barricaded door. Collecting the thermite has you going to the first 0G section of the game, then into another medical section to get the other component you need to ignite the thermite. This is where the first skip of the run is. When leaving the 0G section, there is a trick you can do called a tilt. Isaac gets tilted if you spam the melee move out of 0G and onto a slope. When Isaac is in a 0G area, his center of gravity changes depending on the surface that he is standing on. So by constantly punching, you can keep this state out of the 0G area, and once you stop punching, the game looks for a new center of gravity. This center of gravity just so happens to be on a slope. This applies a new center of gravity outside of the 0G to be the slope, and it won't update after that because you're no longer in 0G. This leaves Isaac at an off angle to the actual floor. Everything works as normal, Isaac is just a bit tilted. This is useful because the area where you get the fuel to ignite the thermite has a required combat encounter. But this combat encounter's trigger to start the fight is on the ground. And if you're tilted like this, you can walk over the table instead, skipping right over the fight entirely. Then you head back to the door and use the thermite to blow it open. Grab the rig from the captain's dead body and then head back to the tram. This totals 1 minute and 13 seconds of downtime in a 7-minute level. Chapter 3. After collecting the captain's rig, it's discovered that the ship is falling into orbit and we need to restore the gravity centrifuge and restore power to the main engine. This involves lots of running around and doing puzzles, then doing some combat and activating the engine. There is one small skip on this level. By upgrading your kinesis range, you can pull a lever on the sideways elevator from further away, skipping the entire section. Once the centrifuge is reconfigured, you must travel to the engine room to restart it, then make it back to the tram. This 10-minute level has only 2 minutes of downtime. Chapter 4. This is the chapter where you have to meet up with Hammond and talk for a bit before he sends you to get the ship's asteroid defense system up and running. Before you can do that, you need to get clearance to 2 different locations. Each location has a small puzzle and a lot of enemies to kill, giving you clearance to the next floor. After this, there is a 0G section with 0 oxygen, where you have to wait for asteroids between jumps across a long outside run. The run is punctuated with a long sequence of manually shooting asteroids while you wait for the software to reboot. Once you're done backtracking to the tram, that's the end of the chapter. This roughly takes 14 minutes and has 5.5 minutes of downtime. Chapter 5 is where the gang realizes that the air is being contaminated on the ship. The best solution is to create a poison that can kill the monster that is causing this problem. The objective on Chapter 5 is to gain access to the areas that we need to retrieve the poison elements and then mix them into the poison and get back to the tram. This plan runs into some problems as Isaac is targeted by a new person, a scientist who has been testing on the necromorphs and has created one that can infinitely regenerate. There are several long talking sections in this level, and at the end, a very small boss fight with the regenerator. The level itself is only 8 minutes long, but it has 2.5 minutes of downtime. Chapter 6 is where you take that poison and use it on a monster that is contaminating the air. First, you must pass by Hammond, who tells you what is happening and how to stop it. There are several enemies hidden around a sprawling hub level that you have to kill as they are poisoning the air. You can go through many elevators and a 0G section to do so. Once they are killed, you must go unlock the access to the storage room where the monster is inside, causing the problem. Once inside, you kill the boss and then return to the tram. This chapter is very long, almost 14 minutes, and has a ton of downtime, about 5 minutes of it. Chapter 7 is also insanely long and has 0 speedrun tech. The ship being back to normal, it's time to call for help. Isaac is tasked with placing an SOS beacon on an asteroid, then releasing it from the mining section. First, Isaac reunites with his girlfriend Nicole and sits through a brutal 4.5 minute auto-scroller where you defend her from enemies. Then you go to the asteroid and place the SOS beacon and send it off from a different floor. Once done, you head back to the tram. If you include the Nicole section, this level has nearly 8 minutes of downtime, and half of that is Nicole Tower defense. Chapter 8. This chapter takes place in the same location as Chapter 4, but instead of having to gain security access, you're tasked with restoring the communications array so that someone nearby makes contact with the SOS, the crew can actually communicate with them. Military ship nearby hears the SOS and comes to the aid of the Ishimura. However, to clear a path for them, we must also get on yet another turret section and shoot a boss off the side of the ship. This one is not an auto-scroller though. The better you aim, the faster the boss dies and the quicker the section ends. Once dealt with, the ship starts to dock on the Ishimura and Isaac heads down to the tram to meet up with them. This chapter is short, but it has a lot of elevators and forced combat rooms. Nearly 10 minutes long with 4.5 minutes of downtime, 3 minutes of that being just elevators. Chapter 9. The new ship arrives on the Ishimura, but it wasn't a smooth landing. The crew inside has all already turned into necromorphs, so they were dead on arrival. Isaac is tasked with the harvesting of a part from the ship to use it on the Ishimura. This level is completely broken. It starts with a 0G section and an entire level is done in 0G. After removing radioactive material from the 0G section, you can jump straight out of bounds and then onto an elevator, and then eventually back inbounds inside the ship, but with 0G still active where it normally wouldn't be. The entire level is done without oxygen, so it's on a timer. After grabbing the piece, we head back to the tram, through the ship. The level is about 6.5 minutes long, with 1 minute of downtime of an unskippable cutscene right in the middle of the level. Chapter 10. Hammond discovered a shuttle that could be used to escape the Ishimura, but the shuttle is missing 3 parts that it needs to be able to work correctly. They have been spread out around the area by someone and Isaac has to collect all 3, then repair the shuttle. Once he finds the shuttle, the person who hid the parts reveals himself and Isaac has to fight a regenerator again. The shuttle is repaired and Isaac returns to the tram to get down to the shuttle. This level is super long, 15 minutes, and it has 5.5 minutes of downtime. Chapter 11. The new member convinces Isaac that the marker is the key to this entire event and needs to be taken back to the planet to stop the madness. So Isaac goes to storage and collects the marker, carrying it back from the docks up to Chapter 1. Then Kendra kills the scientist and takes the shuttle, leaving Isaac stranded. This is when Isaac meets up with Nicole and they use the gravity array to pull the shuttle back to the docks and get on the shuttle while Kendra escapes on an escape pod. This chapter is about 10 minutes long and has just over 3 minutes of downtime. Chapter 12, the final chapter. This level is very long, but mostly consists of escorting the marker to its original place and watching lots of unskippable cutscenes. After returning the marker, Isaac heads back to the shuttle to escape and is confronted by a giant necromorph boss fight. The level itself is about 13 minutes long and has 4.5 minutes of cutscenes near the end. Thankfully, this cutscene can be skipped by just not looking at it and looking away. If you do this, you can have the lurkers from the previous room hit you during the cutscene and have it be skipped. Even with this trick, the level is about 11% downtime, with 1.5 minutes of unskippable cutscenes. That's not including the final cutscene after you defeat the boss either, because the time ends at the cutscene. So, at this time, there was only 2 major skips, one on Chapter 2 and one on Chapter 9. 3 if you count the cutscene skip on Chapter 12. It is a substantial time save after all. Other than that, the run is basically, as of May 2020, essentially glitchless. There was a total of 57 minutes and 30 seconds of downtime in that run. A 39.9% of total playtime was downtime. 22.7% of that was cutscenes. 12.4% of that was elevators. That's 17 minutes and 48 seconds of just elevators. That's actually a crazy large amount of the run to be downtime. On top of that, the pacing of the run itself wasn't ideal. It starts slow and all the longer levels have the highest percentage of downtime. Chapter 7 has 8 whole minutes of it. You can see why it wouldn't be the most popular speedrun. Not only do you need at least 2.5 hours to be able to finish a run, but a large minority of that run will be downtime. And the heavy amount of that downtime will literally be at the very start of the run. Any mistake large enough to potentially make you reset could be the mistake that makes you not able to do any more runs that day. Because doing another attempt is another 2.5 hour time investment. On top of all that, the hardest section in the whole run is Chapter 9, a whole hour and 40 minutes into the speedrun. There are very few people interested in fixing such a problem. Generally, if a game isn't broken 12 years after its release, that means it's probably pretty solidly constructed. And on the surface, that seemed to be the case for Dead Space as well. But that doesn't mean there wasn't anything you could do to make the game more fun to run. It was discovered that you could actually just delete the rig videos from the game files on PC and it skips them. If you go to the files, then movies, then delete everything in the English folder, when the rig videos are supposed to play in game, they are just skipped. This also fast forwards any progression that was previously tied to these rig videos. This turns out to have no negative consequences and saves 7 minutes, all of which was previously downtime. The problem was that this was only possible on PC, and at the time, console and PC versions of the game competed directly with each other on the same leaderboard. So allowing PC to make this change would just make it 7 minutes faster than console for free. While not unheard of, it's obviously not ideal for all platforms to be competing directly with each other. But for the sake of the run being more fun to run in the future, it's something that had to be taken into consideration. The deletion of these files would be called no rig videos and eventually made into a miscellaneous category. With some pushback, it was eventually made into the main category and just the default way of playing on PC, with its own any % category. This turned out to be a really good decision too, because while the game had no load screens, which you would think means that there is no hardware advantage on PC as compared to console, this is actually anything but the case. As it turns out, better hardware makes every single door in the game open faster. This is because the room behind the door loads faster, allowing for the door to open faster. This saves a very non-trivial amount of time depending on what hardware you're using. On top of that, the game's fastest movement speed is at 30 FPS, making playing it optimally on PC super painful. The slowdown was only really minor unless you had over 200 FPS, where the game would have major slowdown. And in addition to that, the game probably has some of the worst mouse support in any third-person shooter out there. Because the game was programmed for console, then retrofitted for PC, they didn't bother to actually make the mouse support native. Instead, the game emulates a controller with the mouse, making the default mouse settings have a very strong mouse deceleration. This means the faster you swipe, the slower you turn. So PC is the fastest version, but it comes with a ton of baggage. Unfortunately, this makes the game a lot less accessible. The curse of the Dead Space speedrun returns. If you want to run the game competitively, you basically had to be playing on PC and with a good rig, but you had to be playing at 30 FPS. Then you could remove the rig videos and make the doors faster. This is by far the most optimal way to play, and the most enjoyable, except for the 30 FPS. Because this is the case, it strongly disincentivizes anyone from running any other version of the game, which makes the game less accessible. Which is the last thing you want to have happen to a game like Dead Space, considering it already had a very sparse amount of runners and attention on it. This would continue to be the case until late 2022, when Dead Space 2 would go through its own tech revolution. The advent of deloads would bring the game down over 20 minutes, and the revolutionary energy from Dead Space 2 would provoke some of the leading revolutionaries of that game to make their way over to Dead Space 1. Most notably Rhesus, who would change the game forever. He took a look at all the parts of the game, seeking for any cracks in the armor, any way for this behemoth of a game to become faster. And he was succeeding. First, he found an out of bounds in the Chapter 4 0G section. At first, it really didn't do anything, but with help from Living Looney Bin, they were able to make the full alternate path from the turret, auto-scroller on Chapter 4, all the way to the end of the level. Instead of taking all of those elevators to get back to the tram and having to deal with the combat on the way back, he does this by 0G jumping onto the railing, and then from the top of the railing, he can 0G jump back into the void. When doing so, he falls out of the 0G bounding box, losing his 0G. Then he falls to the roof of the lobby. From there, he does some out of bounds movement in a deloaded level and falls in bounds and gets to the end of the level. This skip saved nearly 2 minutes, but was just too hard to perform. Not only did you have to get the dodgy 0G jumps to go where you want, but you also had to navigate some tricky out of bounds movement in a deloaded pitch black level. And if you fell into any small hole, you would get stuck and have no way to save it. If that happened, you would just have to die and try again, losing a ton of time. On top of all that, the trick is done in a vacuum. This means the whole time you are losing oxygen, and when the counter on Isaac's shoulder reaches 0, Isaac will die. Even though you jump out of the 0G section, you technically never leave the vacuum. Vacuums in Dead Space are tied to the entry and exit Zors of the vacuums themselves. So because you never leave a vacuum door, it sticks around forever. Unlike the 0G properties, that end when you leave the bounding box of them. The time limit here is really tight in a new game run. This required a reroute that got some air refills for this trick specifically. Even with an air refill though, you barely have enough time to do the trick, usually getting into the tram with less than 10 seconds of air left. Thankfully, the tram makes Isaac invincible when transitioning from one chapter to the next. This skip saved about 2 minutes, and nearly all of that comes from skipping elevators, which is great because not only did it make the run faster, but it also did so by almost exclusively removing downtime. And if Dead Space wanted to be more popular and fun for a speedrun, it would need to not only be faster, but also have a better downtime to gameplay ratio. A few more skips like this, and things would look promising. Rhesus would not stop anytime soon. In fact, he was about to change Dead Space speedrunning forever. While trying to clip Isaac through a wall with the pulse rifle, Rhesus had unbound stomp from spacebar, then accidentally held it down when aiming to try and clip. Then he got sent flying, and the game would never be the same. Rhesus had completely on accident found a glitch so important it would single-handedly revolutionize Dead Space and would inevitably save over an hour in the speedrun once its potential was fully realized. What Rhesus had found was that all guns in this game have their own independent collision. This collision can push you away from walls when you aim into them. This was known, but what wasn't known is that if you unbind the spacebar from stomp, that leaves one function for the key, and that is the alternative fire. Doing this enables you to buffer the alternate fire, so the alternate fire comes out the first frame you aim. With the pulse rifle, the alternate fire is, in the words of Susie,
the fuck everything button.
where Isaac gets on one knee and proposes a trade offer. He wastes all of his ammo and the enemies go away. When he does this, he is lurched forward and puts his gun out. If done into a wall, this basically instantly puts the entire pulse rifle into the wall, giving a huge boost away from it. It was also found that the game detects collision based on the frame rate it is being run at. So a higher frames per second, the game detects the gun being in the wall more times and tries to push it out of the wall more times as well, giving more speed. This also scales infinitely with frame rate. This tech instantly changed the game. Overnight, what was a relatively tame speedrun became one of the craziest I've ever seen. The dark ages of Dead Space speedrunning were seemingly over. This revolution had the potential to completely change the landscape of the speedrun in a good way. It would all come down to the implementation of each of these new potential tricks. No matter what, making the run shorter from 2.5 hours was a good thing. But ideally, you would want to do so by primarily removing downtime and in a way that is fun to do and consistent. Otherwise, you could be potentially trading one evil for another. What Rhesus was working on was skipping having to talk to Hammond in Chapter 4. This would skip about a minute of waiting. He was trying to do this by pulse boosting into a slope and getting airtime over the railing and landing out of bounds. Using ramps like this to fly out of bounds would be the single biggest discovery with pulse boosting, and it was found immediately. This discovery was so big it instantly opened up skips in almost every other chapter. Based on some of the initial testing, it seemed like almost every level only requires 1 or 2 triggers or objectives to be achieved before simply having to return to the tram for the chapter to end. You can skip almost every objective on most chapters. This, combined with the universal applicability of the pulse boost, made doing any full game speedruns completely pointless for at least a few months. Every single day something new was found. New tricks, new setups, and it would eventually culminate into tens of minutes of time save. The problem was that with how little was known about this tech at its conception, so much was left to learn about pulse boosting. What are the factors in what kind of boost you get? How do you increase airtime, and how do you route it into the actual run? On top of that, the game going from a run where you never leave the ground to spending potentially half of your time in the air and out of bounds creates a lot of new and interesting problems. For one, the trick was frame rate based, so console runners couldn't do big boosts. And if you were allowed to run the game at any FPS, you could potentially lead to skips being found that only work at frame rates that are only obtainable with really good hardware, and upwards of 200 FPS. The community decided to put an upper limit on the frame rate, at 200 frames per second. Due to the game's well-optimized state on PC, most hardware could reach this at the time. It also allowed for some really good distance on the pulse boost without butting up against the slowdown of the movement speed at higher frame rates. Frame rate aside though, this forced the Dead Space speedrunning scene to test things in a way that they had never done before. Learning how the game loads in new areas, what triggers are and are not required for progression in each individual chapter, and figuring out what pulse boosting can actually let you cheat. This is a daunting task for a game as big as Dead Space, and it would be a revolution that to this day continues to break new ground. On top of that, the tricks that were found were very difficult. Completing a run with some of these tricks was damn near impossible without failing at least a couple of them a couple of times. This is because the look angle and the timing of the alternate fire affect the speed and height of every single launch. And especially the early setups for a lot of these tricks were insanely precise. This led to many tricks being known for a long time, but not actually ever done in a full game run until many months after their discovery. And even when they were finally implemented, it was usually a huge grind to complete a run that wasn't full to the brim of deaths and mistakes. Since October 14, 2020, the world record for Dead Space any percent improved only 8 times, but went down 44 minutes and 48 seconds. Each new run would introduce a multitude of new glitches and skips that would save insane amounts of time. These runs would not necessarily happen right after the tech was discovered, but the order in which they were implemented into full game runs is a huge tell as to how difficult they were. The first world record with pulse boosting in it is Rampancy's 152.22. This run would implement a few new tricks, and with each new one, the landscape of the game would change entirely. Even if it would take a whole month before a run was even done after pulse boosting would be found. Chapter 3 would be the first chapter that would receive a huge skip. Looney would find this one skipping almost the entirety of the chapter. Literally, right as you gain control of Isaac, you can pulse boost onto the roof of the tram, then into the tunnel. From the tunnel, you can Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and ride the pipe, having it launch you out of the end of the pipe and over the rest of the level. Landing on top of the level lets you get close to the 0G door at the end of the level. You can then perform a door dive. This is where you fall into the door and open it while falling. On specific doors, this causes the level to load in around Isaac, making it the best way to get back in bounds. This skip on Chapter 3 combined with pulse boosting down the hallways saves nearly 8 minutes over glitchless. It was by far the biggest skip at the time. It also removed about 1 minute and 30 seconds of downtime and 6 minutes of 30 seconds of gameplay. This trick was difficult, but ultimately found to be consistent. Most levels were expected to look similar to this after the tricks were found. Chapter 4 had the skip I covered previously and something new that I'll talk about later, but it was deemed too hard and didn't save enough time for it to be done in full game runs for the time being. Chapter 10, it was discovered that you only needed to collect one of the 3 pieces normally required to complete the level. So instead of grabbing all 3, you just immediately head to the right side basketball court through the bathrooms and grab the one there. Once it's grabbed, you can head back to the hub room and use this table to get out of bounds. Placing the table in the corner at the top by the elevator lets you run out of the elevator when you send it back down. When the elevator realizes that you're no longer on it, it goes back up and you can ride the top of the elevator to get on top of the table. Once the lift stops, the table gets impacted by the collision of the lift and flips the table over. This pushes Isaac out of bounds. From here, you can line up a walk off to the top of the door. This saves 11 minutes. Unfortunately, it only cuts out about 2.5 minutes of downtime, but 8 minutes and 40 seconds of gameplay. A huge time save, but more than doubles the downtime percentage on this level. The next trick that was added would be the first but not last time that Apathy would do a trick that was deemed nearly impossible. It was inevitable with the current speedrunning tech revolution that there would be a trick so precise and difficult that it was nearly impossible to do consistently. But up to this point, none of the tricks had ever been done in a state that was deemed undoable. At least not in a run, and not yet. Usually these skips are put on the shelf until they made more consistent and deemed usable in full game. But all it takes is one person with some insane determination to actually go for one of those skips that everyone is avoiding. And once they hit it, they will become unbeatable. And in Chapter 11, Apathy would do just that. In Chapter 11, Apathy immediately boosts into the tram tunnel and then out of bounds through the roof. Once on top, he travels by foot towards the save station hallway and jumps down to this area. Apathy would do his setup facing towards the tram and did a pulse boost to send him flying vertically towards the docking station in Chapter 1. Once in the air, he would hit the trigger checkpoint and die, respawning him in the 0G room. In order to get a boost this high at 200 FPS, you had to do something special. Not only was the checkpoint small, so you had to hit the lineup perfectly, but you needed to hit the best possible boost. There is one frame that Isaac gets a much bigger boost on than every other in the timing of the boost. This frame perfect boost is actually required to hit this trick. This being done in a run was absolutely insane. If it wasn't for the discovery of other huge time saves and the difficulty of the run overall, then this trick alone would have completely killed most people's motivation to ever run the game again. How can you expect anyone to get an hour and 40 minutes into a run, especially a run as hard as Dead Space, and then require them to hit a frame perfect trick at 200 FPS that saves almost 7 minutes? A better setup was made for a slightly slower version of this skip, and it was discovered that it only lost about 2 minutes compared to this frame perfect version. But Apathy would opt to grind for this version for every single one of his runs. Chapter 12 also had a huge cut. The start of the mission is in the same place that the mission ends. The building right across from the start of the mission has a checkpoint in it that if you hit it, transitions the entire area into the area at the end of the level. You can boost onto the support pillar, then walk up it onto the invisible wall above the railing that stops you from falling off the map. You can walk then from there to the roof and do a very precise boost to land on top of the door, then door dive back into the level and trigger the final boss. Before the boss can spawn though, you have to restart checkpoint. The easiest way to do this is just boost into the sky and die. This causes the final boss to spawn, skipping the entire level. This cut the level down from a 12.5 minute level to 3.5, and skips half of the cutscenes in the level. A speedrun revolution like this is not what everyone wanted. It certainly wasn't ideal, and would require the leaderboard for the game to change very rapidly to reflect the new, now much larger community sensibilities. and to compensate for these new discoveries. The moderation team at the time was primarily made up of console runners that had little to no experience moderating a PC speedrunning leaderboard. PC speedruns have a multitude of issues when it comes to moderation and quality of life that console speedruns just don't have problems with. Things like frame rate caps and limits, the ability to modify the game, and loading time variations. There was a lot of drama and chaos involved with the moderation for the game at the time, but eventually, no rig videos was just allowed and expected to be regular any % category on PC. There was then a console and PC category split. Resus also created a mod for PC that skipped the intro cutscene and let you start the run controlling Isaac, shaving 4.5 minutes off of every reset. This was allowed, and all runs were retimed to start the timer when you gain control of Isaac. This allowed for everyone to compete fairly without having to use the mod, and still gave room for quality of life improvements for those who wanted it. This was huge for the speedrun. Obviously, sitting and watching a cutscene for almost 5 minutes at the start of every run is not something that most people want to do, especially in a run as brutal and punishing as Dead Space. It really seemed like things were just getting better and better for the Dead Space speedrun. To add to the chaos, Resus had just before the discovery of pulse boosting found a new skip in Chapter 1 called Hammond Skip. When Hammond is walking into the first room of the game, you can body block him so that he gets pushed closer to the door than he normally does at the end of his walking sequence. This door usually locks Isaac behind it so you can't backtrack into the cutscene. Doing this will cause the door to not close as Hammond is too close to it. This way you can walk back into the cutscene room while the cutscene is playing and watch them all die up close. The door Kendra opens goes to an elevator that leads right to the end of the chapter. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be a full level skip for now, as the tram would still need to be repaired before you can actually end the chapter. There is a shop right here though, which allows you to buy the pulse rifle and the plasma cutter, and the latter is actually free. It was discovered later though that you can actually skip out of the tram room prior to activating the repair. By pulse boosting off of the ramp, you can bounce over the tram as it's being repaired and land in the tram tunnel. Then you can simply walk to the elevator and grab the keys to repair the tram hub and then return them. After that, you can head to the tram and the end of Chapter 1. This skips most of the waiting in the first chapter with the Hammond push. Then it skips the waiting for the tram room to unlock. There is also 2.5 minutes of rig videos on this level that are now removed. There is one problem though. You can't enter the elevator right away after boosting out of the tram room. If you do, the tram gets repaired, but the actual model for the tram is deloaded before it's moved into place, and then it never gets fixed. So the end level trigger is there, but you just can't press it because it's floating midair and you can't reach it, causing a soft lock. There was still about 30 seconds of waiting that could potentially be removed if you were able to press this button midair from a pulse boost. With the intro skip, Hammond push was something that was much more reasonable. If you missed the push, you wouldn't have to rewatch 5 minutes of cutscenes every single time. Zio would be the next to break a world record, implementing 3 new tricks nearly 2 months later on exactly the last day of 2020. The first one would be the Hammond skip that Resus had found much prior. He was the first to implement it in his runs. Then, Chapter 6 skip. Instead of clearing the level of the Weezer fans, you instead head right to the tentacle room. By placing a line gun mine in this position, then waiting for a second before triggering the tentacle and on the left side of the wall, if done correctly, the tentacle will grab Isaac, and then when it dies, he gets stuck in the wall and is pushed onto the roof. From there, you can scale the big hub room to get to the other side of it and set up on this ledge of the roof. From here, you can walk off the map and fall into the boss room, pausing to let the game load in around you. The problem is that because the boss door was not open from the outside, you are now locked inside with the boss. From here, the boss fight is done normally. Once killed, you manually punch your way into the boss's geometry and pray you can get flipped onto the outside of the level. This setup was really inconsistent. Once out of bounds and on the roof though, you can 0G jump back over the boss hallway and walk towards the boss door. From there is only one more obstacle that stops you from returning to the tram, and that's getting back in bounds. There is a small gap right before the boss door that Isaac can't jump over. So you have to do a very precise damage boost to jump the gap. From there, it's a door dive to get back in bounds and finish the level. This leads to a 10-minute level, about a 4-minute time save, and it cuts out a ton of elevators, almost 2 minutes of them. With a better setup though, this trick could save a ton more time, as this was just the first run ever completed with it done successfully. He would also implement one other trick on Chapter 7. This trick had been known for a while, but no one had actually done it in a run. There is a section where Isaac is locked in a room and has to kill a few enemies before he's allowed to leave, but you can grab a box from the previous room that has Swarm in it. Then you carry it to the door and break it in the door frame while the door is open. This spawns the Swarm. You can then stasis them and press the button and pulse boost back out of the room while the Swarm are still holding open the door. This saves about a minute. Zio also has better overall execution in the rest of the game than Rampancy did, but played it safer on Chapter 11 and did the slower but more consistent version of it. Rampancy would once again take the record back with a 1:30:27 on the 21st of January 2021. Of course, Rampancy once again did the frame perfect Chapter 11 skip in this run. He was the only one that could perform it consistently. Well, that's not true. Even he couldn't perform it consistently. He just grinded out enough runs until he actually hit it. This type of trick can really be the death of a game. No one wants to grind for that. Well, except for Rampancy, I guess. He's just a freak of nature. And competition is one of the most important elements to a game being active. Who dare challenge the man that is going to run the game in this state, though? This potentially could kill the game right after this revolution brought life into the game after stagnating for so long. With Dead Space 2 being recently showcased at Games Done Quick, it seemed like it was finally time for the first Dead Space game to get some spotlight. Looney would be the one to do it. He got Dead Space into Summer Games Done Quick 2021, but there was a problem. Dead Space is not a very marathon-friendly speedrun. Performing a speedrun like Dead Space live in front of over 100,000 people is an insanely tense and nerve-wracking experience. Mistakes being so catastrophic with the tricks being so precise makes for a really high-stakes experience. Looney had one job: make the run as consistent and safe as possible. So that's exactly what he did. He went through the run and retested and found new setups for a ton of the tricks. Primarily Chapter 6, it was faster and more consistent to pulse boost through the dead boss rather than punch, and Chapter 11 was made consistent and faster with a new alternative setup. Unlike the previous alternative that was 2 minutes slower, this method was even faster than the old one that Rampancy was doing. It also wasn't frame perfect, so that's a plus. It has the player boosting vertically towards the end of the level, but instead of hitting the checkpoint and dying, you pause during the load trigger and have the level load in around you. This saved dying to reload the area, which saved about 30 seconds. On top of this, Looney also started implementing a better Chapter 4 skip. Instead of skipping just Hammond and the brute fight, he skipped all the way from the start of the level to the roof and to the stratosphere. This would hit the checkpoint right before the 0G section, and you would respawn there when you die. This skip saved another few minutes and made the 0G return for the tram way more worth it. It skips all of the elevators in the level, removing most of the downtime except for the turret defense section. The level had a much larger percentage of downtime now, but almost zero elevators. Looney would use these improvements to snipe the world record with a 1:29:52 for about 4 days, when Rampancy would take it back, improving it by a whole 10 minutes. He did so by implementing the Chapter 4 skips that Looney did, as well as a new Chapter 9 out of bounds. Instead of having to remove the radioactive balls before doing it out of bounds, a faster way to return to the ship without having to go back inbounds was found. The balls were tossed out before because tossing them out unlocks a door, and that door needed to be unlocked to make the return inbounds. A nice side effect of doing the return out of bounds is that there is never a vacuum, so you can't suffocate to death. The downside is, the trick is just very hard. Returning out of bounds requires Isaac to make many completely blind jumps across a blank black background. Then, you clip through the wall with the jump through back in bounds right before the tram. This skip saves about 30 seconds over the previous and just cuts out the radioactive balls. Chapter 12 will get a revamp on its boosts as well, a more consistent standing boost for the final boost. Standing boosts are a relatively unused tech that is just a pulse boost, but while standing still. These give you less speed and less height, but they're 100% consistent, because you don't have to time the boost mid-running animation. This boost is still super precise and a run killer, but it's much better than the one they were using before. Looney actually used this version in his run, but what Looney didn't do is the 2 new boosts to get to this location much faster. Finally, the last big thing that helped Rampancy save this 10 minutes was this new skip, Chapter 8 skip. And once again, Rampancy would perfect a trick that nearly no one else could replicate. This time it was the same initial setup as Chapter 4 skip, but instead of dying on the second boost, you do a standing boost to land on top of the floor above you. From there, you do another standing boost, this time about 1,000 times more precise than the previous one. The goal is to hit a checkpoint trigger right before the boss fight at the end of the level. This skip saves about 4 minutes. Once again, right when the run seems like it's finally becoming more consistent, Apathy sends it into chaos. This time, Looney was not able to make a better setup for it. Not before his GDQ run at least. He would attempt this trick in that run, but miss it. The GDQ run is a perfect example of why these types of events are so important. Because the wider audience of speedrunning had no idea what had been happening in Dead Space in the last year. Dead Space to them was still a mostly glitchless, boring 2.5 hour long speedrun that they've maybe seen on YouTube once or twice. But after this event, that image was changed. The Dead Space speedrun that people saw was a cool, difficult, and crazy speedrun, and the game's activity exploded. The game saw an insane amount of new runners. Even Distortion 2 himself, one of speedrunning's all-time gods, joined in on the fun. There was just one problem. This skip. Chapter 8 skip. It was still insanely precise. The community had some time before it would become a major problem though, as the new runners would have to catch up to Apathy before not being able to do the trick consistently would be a big enough problem to make them stop running the game. It's fine if you can't do a trick when you're just starting out, but if it's the only reason that you can't contest the world record, that's usually grounds to just stop running the game. This was the position that the community was in. They needed a solution, and fast. This was when there was a suggestion made to allow the players to change their max FPS cap mid-run. The game would still have a max cap of 200, so most rigs would be able to compete and no new skips would be found at higher frame rates. But the proposed rule would be that you could change the cap to almost anything you want as long as it's under 200. This is because there was some setups being found for skips at lower frame rates that were more consistent, especially Chapter 8. The vote was held and this rule change passed, saving the run from utter demise at the hands of Apathy and Chapter 8 skip. This new setup was a running boost at 130 FPS, but it was much better for getting the exact distance you needed to get the checkpoint. Chapter 6 would also be made much faster with this rule change, allowing for a pulse boost to get on top of the big room instead of having to walk up a hill. Apathy would have his last record that would not take advantage of this rule change with his 1:15:02. This run had all the same tech as the 120, it was just much more optimized, less mistakes, and better overall play. With Chapter 11 and Chapter 8 both seemingly going to kill the run and then fixed, it feels like Dead Space is finally getting to enter a phase of growth that it deserved the entire time. Big streamers learning the speedrun, more active players than ever before, and quickly approaching the sub 1 hour mark. But if there is anything that has been learned from this journey, it's that Dead Space is a doomed speedrun. While this brief moment of prosperity was amazing, there was always some shadow following the game around, until one day it would overtake the game again, and plunge it into darkness. One day, while Distortion 2 was streaming and looking for potential new speedrun skips in Dead Space, Looney would come into his chat and give him a suggestion. A theorized skip for Chapter 5. The tram tunnel at the start of the level had a decent lineup for a boost out of it, and towards the end of the level. If you could manage to hit a checkpoint somewhere over there, then you could turn the essentially glitchless Chapter 5 into a huge skip, potentially saving up to 8 minutes. For hours and hours, Dist would test and try new methods and techniques for trying to hit anything on this level. This double door is the door that leads into the boss fight with the regenerator, right at the end of the level. There is a known checkpoint right behind this door, but it's very small, much smaller than the door, and to hit it, you have to go through the checkpoint sideways. The setup that Dist had worked out that was getting really close was to boost into the tunnel from the tram, then at 130 FPS boost off the right side and land on top of the tram railing. From then, you would walk down to the end of the railing and make a small jump onto the cylinder. From here, you walk through the pillar and turn around. Then, while standing on a tiny platform, you pulse boost off of the pillar at a 45-degree angle. This would give you somewhat consistent boosts, at least in the right direction almost every time, but never the same boost twice. Because the run up to the trick is so precise and the platform you do it on is a slope, your timing and positioning need to be beyond humanly precise. After hours and hours of launches, Dist calls it. Maybe he'll hit it tomorrow. Then, this is when Apathy smelled blood in the water. A skip that is impossibly precise that no one can do? Apathy knew what he needed to do. And a few hours later, he hits it. And it worked. A roughly 5-minute time save with a complicated setup. Dist would then also pull it off the next day in practice. But in an actual run, there was no way that anyone would even attempt this, right? In about 6 hours of practice, you maybe could get the trick one time. And that's with using a trainer to restart and retry the boost over and over again without having to redo the entire setup. Not to mention, it's nearly 25 minutes into the run. After an already difficult first 4 chapters, you would have to gamble everything on maybe 1 or 2 attempts at the trick that is so precise, it's essentially random. And on top of that, even if you hit it, you still had to complete the rest of the run in an already insanely brutal speedrun. Surely, no one would even attempt this trick in runs. Except for Rampancy. Rampancy would then 4 days later finish a run with this skip, a 1:12:10. The run was, in his own words, ass. The rest of the run was not very good, and the chapter 5 skip wasn't first try. With enough time passing, the rest of the runners would catch up to where Rampancy was before he did the chapter 5 skip in a run. His run was basically unbeatable if you didn't do the skip. But Rampancy was afraid that Dist would eventually hit the skip, and then he would have to do it again. So before that would happen, Rampancy would just have to beat him to it. 2 weeks later, on July 31st, 2021, he would put yet another nail in the coffin of Dead Space with a 1:09:24. He hits chapter 5 skip first try, and the rest of the run is pretty okay. It's not amazing, not everything was first try, but absolutely staggering because he also did chapter 5 skip on this run. This was attempting to get a good run with chapter 5 skip, and he wanted to give Rampancy some competition, but it just proved to be too painful to attempt. This would eventually give up on Dead Space speedrunning because he just didn't want to run the game without doing chapter 5 skip, but he also couldn't stand the run with it. Many other runners would follow suit. The future that chapter 11 skip and chapter 8 skip seemed to promise was manifesting in real time due to an entirely different skip in chapter 5. And Rampancy was determined to set the last nail in the coffin. He would grind for one more run, where he would then hit chapter 5 skip first try again. The run wasn't perfect. He failed chapter 12 skip once and had some other minor mistakes, but the run is so godly and nigh unbeatable that it may have sealed Dead Space's fate forever, making it a doomed speedrun once again. Rampancy has had the world record for Dead Space NE% with his 1:08:07 since October 24th of 2021. No one else has ever hit chapter 5 skip in a run, and at this rate, no one ever will. Is Dead Space doomed to be forever this way? Well, hopefully not. There's always the potential for new strategies to emerge, ones that replace or remove the need for chapter 5 skip, but as of right now, if you ever want to compete with Rampancy, you just have to do the trick. Hopefully a more consistent and reliable strategy that runners in the future can use to push the game even further will emerge. But until then, Rampancy will remain the undisputed god of not only chapter 5, but also Dead Space in general. The Dead Space speedrun failed to become a more popular and active run, not only because of its length or amount of downtime, but also because the game got too technical for its own good. Ironically, in the pursuit of bigger and bigger skips, more and more gameplay was being skipped, leaving more and more downtime in the run. Rampancy's world record has 25 minutes and 14 seconds of downtime in it. That's 51.7% of the run being downtime, over half. And the parts that aren't are almost exclusively brutally difficult and technical tricks. The glitchless run may have 53 minutes and 33 seconds of cutscenes, but it's only 40.4% downtime. In a sad twist of fate, it seems that the skips that were meant to save Dead Space from this curse were destined to become the very things that would curse it once again. For now. Thanks so much for watching, I really appreciate it. It has been a while since I have uploaded on this channel, but I'm planning to fix that with this video. To my patrons and people who have supported me this year, I really appreciate it. If you missed it, I've been uploading content this whole time on my 2 other YouTube channels, building them up from basically nothing. Now that those are in a good position, I'm very excited to get back into making more long-form content like this. Anyway, thanks again for watching and stay stylish.